Lannister. Chapter 51. Conversation before departure. If we hit top 25, I will release another chapter tomorrow. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. There was a tension in the air. Not a bad part of the tension, but a sort of strange finality as she supped at her water. It was Callum's last day with them. The ship to return him to the Westerlands was already in the harbor, and Elia wasn't entirely sure how to feel about it. Since their mother died, Callum had been a nearly continuous presence in the lives of the Martell siblings. Whether it was his constant chattering with a Baron about something or other, his dinner conversations with Doran, or the few little adventures Elia herself had been on with him. While little baby Ariane was still the darling of Sunspear, Callum had well and truly become a fixture in their little family. He had been an energizing presence, always pushing the presses forward, or working on some sort of strange contraption or idea. Everyone had noticed the strange coterie of artisans that he had asked Doran to recruit for him. Since they had arrived, he was rarely without one or more of them, but that didn't stop his work at all. Indeed, a Baron had become fast friends with the Summer Islander shipwright Molo, and Callum had worked with both of them on a blueprint for a potential new dockyard at Planky Town. Elia had looked over the drawings herself and it had seemed impressive enough. Dorne had lacked a real navy since Nymeria burned her 1,000 ships, but perhaps they could change that soon enough. At any rate, Callum had been good to House Martell, and now he was leaving. That was the crux of the matter. Elia frowned as she glanced across the room at him, talking quietly with Doran about something or other. She walked over quietly, not wanting to interrupt, but also wanting to spend time with him. She would likely not see him for years after this. Possibly not even until they were to be married. Children grew fast, he might be a completely different person by the time she met him again. That thought sat bittersweet in her mind. She had come to like the little boy who was always chasing some wild dream and trying to make it happen. I think you could do it if you brought them to your palace more frequently. Callum was talking to her brother, twirling his hair around his finger. His hair was longer now than it had been in King's Landing. He had not had it cut since he arrived in Dorne. You need to build a sort of shared, let's call it a regional identity. Dorne already has one to an extent, but you need it to be centered on House Martell to get the best use out of it. It's not that simple though. Men hold to their lords, Doran replied, stroking his chin. The type of development you're proposing could take decades, generations probably, and a weakening of the lordly houses. Not necessarily. Callum rebutted, on the timeline at least. Subverting the lordly houses isn't so difficult, the approach simply needs to change, the boy said, tilting his head. Men are loyal to the leader that is closest to them, that has the most presence in their lives. If you wish their loyalty to go to you, you must become closer to them, impact them more greatly. That is not so easily done, Doran started, but Elia cleared her throat. Excuse me, Doran, but do you mind if I steal Callum for a bit? She cut in as they both turned to look at her. She glanced down and gave the boy a smile. I think, well, before you leave I'd like to talk to you about a few things. I suppose we can continue our discussion later. Doran acquiesced, and Elia gave him a short nod. Callum blinked, then quickly nodded. Yes, that would make sense. He seemed to fidget a bit in place. Do you want to speak here or? The south balcony will suit us fine, I think. Elia saw that he was glancing towards the door, and he shot her a grateful smile as they walked together in that direction. It wasn't very far at all down a brownstone passageway covered in tapestries and finely woven rugs. The southern balcony was a small pavilion atop the southern-facing shelf of the old palace, looking out over the vast deserts of Dorne stretching out to the south of Sunspear. It was actually shaded by the bulk of the castle for most of the day. Because of its relatively less exposed position, part of the balcony was made into a garden with water pumped up from the deep wells below the castle, feeding a small collection of palm trees and other desert plants. During the hours of the day when the harsh sunlight did break over the castle into the garden, a series of awnings were rolled out from the palace wall to protect the small green gem from the blazing heat of the Dornish sun. For the moment though, the sky was clear and blue above their heads, and the sun was hidden behind the huge bulk of the spear tower nearby. Once the two had found their way to some cushioned seating, near a small wicker table that sat near the garden section of the balcony, Elia finally decided to move forward with the conversation. Callum, you are leaving tomorrow, she stated quietly, below the ears of the servants who would no doubt listen otherwise. She'd prefer this conversation to be as private as reasonably possible. I think, well, I do not want to leave anything unsaid between us which could arise later, I think we should discuss our future marriage, that is, our betrothal. Elia had frankly been dreading this conversation for the entire duration of the boy's stay. Not because of anything Callum would do, but because she had bungled it so badly before in King's Landing. She did not want to offend him again and ruin the rapport they'd built between them since he'd come to Dornay. If she said the wrong thing, would he hate her forever? She had already failed twice. What if he'd already given up on the arrangement in his mind? What if he was quietly disgusted by the relationship between their mothers? Sadly, she didn't think it would be wise to leave the topic standing when he returned to Castle Rock. Callum nodded slowly, his eyes becoming sharp as he met her gaze, his voice as low as hers was. I thought that was what this was about. What do you want to discuss, Princess Elia? Elia felt her smile tighten a little, and she shook her head. Still just Elia, please, she said quietly. I don't want there to still be this weight between us when next we meet. Likely as anything the next time we see each other will be just before our wedding. Callum seemed to pause at her words, stilling in his seat. I hadn't thought of it that way, he said after a moment. You're right. It won't do. He leaned back, breathing in heavily through his nose. Truth be told, I do not dislike the idea of marrying you, Elia. He got a cheeky grin on his face. Despite your best efforts, truth be told. The comment was teasing and maybe a bit mean, but she knew he wouldn't have made it if he wasn't already so familiar with her. She had seen many times in the past months that Callum was rare to speak impulsively. That didn't stop the blush that found its way onto her cheeks. I suppose, well, I wasn't very pleasant in King's Landing. I would blame the stress my mother's illness had caused me, but in truth, I was just foolish. Rhaegar was dreamy, of course, but with distance and the trauma of mother's death behind her, Elia had long stowed that dream away. Callum was still a child, but it had struck her one day when cleaning up after a baron's mess that she could have been betrothed to someone far worse. On my part, I do not dislike the idea of marrying you either. It was the honest truth. At the very least, she could say that she knew Callum well enough already. Better him than trying to look elsewhere and rolling a dice on whether she'd end up with a perfect knight or a pig in human skin. That might be a mean thing to think about a baron. Callum looked a bit relieved at her words, his expression relaxing. That's good to hear, he said quietly. Well, I honestly used to be worried about what our marriage might be like if you did. He scratched his cheek. But you've been a very good host while I've stayed here, Elia. Elia smiled, then snorted slightly. Well, I could hardly trust my siblings to do it. Doran's too busy with Ariane and Melario, and if I, a baron, had been the one keeping track of you, then you'd have spent half your time here in a brothel. She narrowed her eyes. Well, he did invite me several times, Callum admitted. But I turned him down. I don't like brothels very much. Elia glanced down at him curiously. Have you been in one? It would be odd if he had. She didn't think Tywin Lannister would let his son into a pillow house knowingly, and Callum seemed a dutiful son. No, nothing like that. Callum waved his hands in front of him. I wouldn't insult your honor like that, Eliano. I just don't like the idea of them, and the way they're, well, you know, half the time they're nearly slavery, the boy said quickly. Many of those women, the whores that is, they didn't all enter their profession happily, or they did but now are being held to not leave it. Callum leaned back in his seat, looking up at the clear sky overhead. The seven-pointed star says that whoring is wrong, and it's probably right, but worse than whoring is the injustice that's rife in those places. I don't think I could ever stomach to visit one. Elia listened to him speak, and smiled gently. Reaching over, she pushed his hair back out of his forehead. Well, I'm glad that I'll have a husband who holds such an opinion. Elia was much less interested in the ethics of such institutions herself. After all, it was hard to imagine a world without them, but she could well appreciate marrying someone who hated them. I'm curious though, have you told your Summer Islander about that? I have been told that whores are sacred in his homeland. Callum raised his hand and made a so-so gesture. That's a little different. There they practice sacred prostitution, and everyone in their society spends some time in their temples as a whore in their youth. Plus they all sleep around in most of their religious ceremonies. Elia couldn't help but giggle as Callum explained the sex cults of the Summer Isles as if they were just the mechanics of some strange invention he was working on. I don't like them very much either, honestly, but it's more like a civic duty for them, like paying taxes or heeding a lord's call to arms. It's not as bad as, Callum paused for a moment. You know, we came out here to talk about our betrothal, but somehow now we've ended up here. He turned to her. I'm sorry, Elia, is there anything else you want to discuss, other than the relative immorality of whores from different regions? Elia smiled back, leaning over and propping herself up on her elbow. No, I think we've already said what we needed to. Plus, it was too funny listening to this kid explain such a lurid topic so dispassionately. You can go ahead and keep going if you'd like. Callum blinked and then stared at her, his eyes narrowing. You know what, fine. Now, as I was about to say, the Summer Islanders are comparatively less disgraceful than Westeros, but Westeros is still much better than the free cities where the not-quite slavery seen in many Westerosi brothels is replaced by open sex slavery. Lee is of course the worst of these and that's why. Elia relaxed, a smile on her face as the blonde boy prattled on, just like he did every day with a Baron or Doran, or indeed with her. Callum had indeed grown on her, and that infectious excitement he had for whatever area of study he was talking about was going to be sorely missed once he left. Still, it wasn't as if she was losing it forever. If all went well, she would have a lifetime of it. Lannister. Chapter 52. Ripples in the Old City. Sir Clegane Pav. He had never admitted it to anyone else, but Clegane really did not like boats. The constant swaying, the discomfort of having the ground shift beneath your feet, the isolation from any possible interaction not found on the ship, all of it stuck in his craw. He'd really prefer if he could avoid them entirely, but he never spoke up on the matter because he figured that the wet dog jokes would be inevitable, and it probably wouldn't get him out of doing it anyway. Ultimately, he was going to end up wherever Lord Tywin wanted him to end up. Thus, when the Blue Wind, the merchant ship that Prince Doran had commissioned to return young Callum and his retinue to the Westerlands, came into the harbor at Aldtown, Clegane could not have been happier to march down the gangplank ahead of his young charge. The solid stone of the Aldtown docks beneath his feet a comforting reminder that the ground existed along with its welcoming embrace. Sadly, this was not to be a particularly long visit. No more than 3 days. Callum had requested to be able to learn at the Citadel for a few months, but his father had refused him, and so they would only stop long enough to greet House Hightower, meet with the head septon of the Starry Sept, and to oversee the conversion of Callum's band of foreign oddballs to the faith of the Seven. And speaking of the faith, excuse me. Clegane glanced over as a septa approached them, her thick blue robes and the necklace with a 7-pointed star hung about her neck standing out immediately from the dockworkers and sailors of the port. Excuse me, is this perchance the ship of Callum Lannister? It is. Clegane stepped aside, as he had been blocking her view of the child behind him, Callum stepping forward almost immediately to greet her. Yes, is there something I can help you with? The boy asked, stepping forward. Ah, it is good to see you've arrived safely, Lord Lannister. She came to a stop and bowed. My name is Prion, I was sent to greet you on behalf of the faith in the city. She smiled. We've heard tell of your mission to spread the 7-pointed star, and we're eager to meet you. She paused. Many of my brothers and sisters are eager to confirm if you are truly blessed by the Smith, as the Gold Star Sept proclaims. Callum paused for a moment, then nodded. I appreciate your greeting, Septa. I stopped in Aldtown to visit the Starry Sept, so I'm glad to be welcomed. He bobbed his head slightly. I also need to make arrangements for several confirmations, 8 in total. Oh. The woman blinked, before smiling. I'm sure we can arrange that. She nodded. When do you intend to visit? I will come personally tonight, and perhaps in 2 days for the confirmations. Callum smiled. My companions have gone through most of the preparations in Dorne and learned the truth of the Seven, but I think it would still be good for them to center themselves first. The blonde boy glanced up at the distant bulk of the Starry Sept, far across the city and nodded. When I come tonight I will be happy to answer any questions you have about the mission I have received. The Septa nodded. I will spread the news. She gave another short bow, then left, hurrying away from where they were unloading the ships. Clegane watched her go, before turning back to Callum, who sat there resting his chin on his hand. The boy's eyes were narrow. Are you concerned with something, my lord? Clegane asked him. It wasn't impossible for Septons to become angry with each other, but Clegane thought it very unlikely that any of them would pose a threat to Callum's person, so it wasn't a great risk. Only that this may be more trouble than I had hoped it would be. My intention was for this to be a quiet visit. Callum stroked his chin. I worried that things like this would become more commonplace after Septa Margot proclaimed me as blessed. I fear it will only become harder for me to avoid announcing myself everywhere. Callum sighed. Well, I'm riding the tiger now, I suppose I'd better not lose my grip. Riding the tiger, my lord? Clegane asked. He hadn't heard the phrase before, probably SOC. He knew that a tiger was a striped lion from Essos. Callum glanced up at him with sharp green eyes, took a moment to think, then explained. A tiger is a vicious beast, being near one at all is dangerous, much less riding it. But if you do find yourself riding one, you'd best not stop, for the moment you fall from its back you'll be under its claws and teeth. The Lannister boy frowned. So it is with the faith. I can only choose to live up to what's expected of me now or be damned before the faith and the people. No other choice is possible. He grumbled. It's not a bad thing to have men call you blessed, my lord, Clegane said, rolling his shoulders and glancing about for any potential dangers. Good King Baelor is still widely loved to this day, and you're as worthy of the title as he was. He may have raised the great sept, but giving every family their own scripture is just as holy a work. Clegane spoke honestly. He didn't even have a copy of the seven-pointed star himself, and he had a keep. He was looking forward to receiving one of the ones that Callum had made with his presses someday. Well, it is a good thing and a holy mission, but I am not Baelor, Callum said quietly. Enough of this talk though. We should go and rent some lodgings for the night. Of course, my lord. Clegane smiled, nodding as he took up position behind Callum. Lead away. They spent roughly the next hour navigating through the narrow cobblestone streets of Aldtown, which was much like Lannisport in its architecture. The primary distinction between the two, as far as Clegane could tell, was that Aldtown was built of solid gray granite for the most part, quarried from the Red Mountains on the southern reach. Lannisport on the other hand was mostly built out of red sandstone cut from the coast of the Westerlands. The other telling difference was the presence of the High Tower, looking over the city just as the rock towered over Lannisport, that in the starry sept sitting proudly on a hill across the Honeywine, which was at least twice the size of the Gold Star sept. Here and there as they passed through the city, Clegane also spotted portholes and stairways leading beneath the ground. He assumed that they led down into the catacombs and undercity of Aldtown, which must be even more expansive than the one in Lannisport given the greater age and population. For his purposes though, it was just another potential danger zone if someone wanted to do Callum harm. Once they found a nice enough inn for Callum and the rest of his retinue to stay at, they made arrangements and the boy let everyone know the plan. They were told to refer to the academic, Qyburn, as Henrik while they were in the city, and he would avoid walking the streets as much as possible. Apparently, he was a former maester who'd been pushed out of the order, which Clegane assumed meant that the healer had fathered a bastard or two. That was the most common way men left the maesters. At any rate, Callum didn't want any trouble with the citadel, so false names and isolation were the method of choice. Aside from that, you'll all be officially confirmed into the faith of the Seven in 2 days, so you should all prepare your spirits. Callum's band of foreign artisans were all gathered up in one of the 6 rooms they'd rented for their stay. It'll all happen in the Starry Sept, possibly overseen by some prominent septons and septas. I'd hoped for it to be a little quieter, but it seems like what I've been doing with my presses has reached this far south already. Is not surprise, press big deal for 7 priests yes. Molo commented. The Summer Islander was reclining on one of the beds, his back propped up against the wall. You are son of Prince, so is natural that way too. I don't especially fancy being made a show of, Mela, the Licini seamstress commented. But I suppose I agreed to it, and your coin has been good. The beautiful woman shrugged. Still, the sooner we reach Lannisport the better. There were murmurs of agreement at that all around. Clegane thought they ought to be more excited to be confirmed in the second most holy sept in the faith, but then, they had only recently been heathens. They knew well enough what confirmation meant at this point, but they hadn't had enough time to understand just how sacred the Starry Sept was. Even Aegon the Conqueror had been crowned there after all, after the Hightowers had thrown their gates open and welcomed him into their city. I want to get home faster too, there's so much I need to get done with you all. Callum nodded, but this step is important too. That it is. Qyburn, or Henrik, chimed in. He had dyed his graying hair brown with some elixir that Clegane didn't recognize and shaved his eyebrows. This will silence many criticisms we would otherwise have faced, and Lord Callum for hiring us, he said placidly to the rest of the assembled artisans, drawing some nods. Though I suspect I will be staying here yes. Yes. Callum nodded. No need to get you out in front of a crowd where someone might recognize you, and you're already an Andal, so people won't make the same assumptions about you anyway. The boy continued, at any rate I. There was a knocking at the door and Callum cut off his words. He glanced over at Clegane, and the knight nodded, moving to open it, sliding it open slightly. He saw it was the innkeeper's son, Bill he believed. What is it? Clegane asked, blocking the view of the rest of the room with his body. Pardon me sir, only there's a maester downstairs looking for Lord Callum, the boy said. Clegane looked down at him, then turned to glance at Callum. It looked like the Lannister had heard it. The blonde child sighed. Tell him we'll be down to see him in a moment, Callum instructed from across the room. Clegane nodded, turning back to the innkeeper's boy. You heard him, let him know we'll be down in a bit. After the boy ran off, Callum sat down and grumbled. And there's the other half of what we're going to need to deal with here. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 277 AC First Moon. Lord Tywin Lannister resumes his duties as Hand of the King in King's Landing, returning to court with his daughter Cersei after an extended leave of absence overseeing affairs in the Westerlands. King Aerys welcomed him back to court with a feast, and announced his provision of a city charter to the town of Duskendale in the Crownlands. Lord Dennis Darklyn had petitioned the king thoroughly over the past few months and received royal approval just before Lord Tywin returned. Lord Tywin was apparently angry with the decision. News trickles back to Westeros that Prince Rhaegar and his fleet had finally reached Volantis, after having earlier been blown off course by a storm out of the boiling sea and having to make port at New Guise. Apparently, only 12 of the original 20 ships made it to Volantis, with some having been blown into the ruins of Old Valyria by the storm, and presumed lost, and 2 sunken fighting pirates from Gogossos. Prince Rhaegar and Lord Steffan Baratheon both survived the journey, however, and were seen in good health petitioning the Volantines. Lannister. Chapter 53. Across the Sea. Volantis was not, in Varys's estimation, a particularly pleasant city. It was hotter than Lee, even though it was more northerly because it bordered on the lands of Always Summer, the once heartland of the great Valyrian freehold at its height. The tropical climate did no favors for him, as sweat was always running down his bald head in rivers, and he could hardly powder his face without the makeup running away in streams. What was worse, one couldn't just walk from place to place and be taken seriously in Volantis. You had to hire bearers, ride a horse or an elephant, or generally have something carrying you at nearly all times. It cut severely into his limited funds and had been particularly painful with the delays that the Westerosi fleet had faced in getting here. A storm out of broken Valyria had set them back nearly 2 months and destroyed a large part of the fleet. Until it had been confirmed that Prince Rhaegar landed on Guise safely, Varys had thought this entire endeavor might have been wasted. Now though, things were looking up. He had greeted the Westerosi at the port, organized palanquins for them to be carried across the city on, and settled them into a small manor in the outer city while he organized rendezvous with some of the high-blooded families within the Black Walls. It was a relatively simple affair if one had the right connections, but it was imperative that everything go according to his plans. This was the best chance Varys had in his life, and he meant to do everything possible to see it succeed. For a decade he had been a mummer's apprentice before he was emasculated by that vile sorcerer. Then for another decade, he had been a thief, before meeting Illyrio. Now he was an information broker, but the interest of the Westerosi king presented an opportunity to become more and do his cousin well in the process. Illyrio would thank him when this was done. And so he has organized this merry tour, sending Prince Rhaegar first to Lee, where he of course found no women of any decent worth. The best of the Lysini knew that their fate in Westeros would likely be miserable, given the history of the Westerosi with the Lysini, so they hid their daughters away and left it to second-class nobles and magisters, grasping social climbers who would likely never appeal to Prince Rhaegar. The plan was always for him to find his way to Volantis. Of course, the intention had been for him to arrive before the most recent election, not after it. The freak storm he had not accounted for in his plans, but Varys was light on his feet, he was still a thief at heart despite it all. So these women I am to meet. Prince Rhaegar certainly looked the part, reclining on a red velvet cushion and eating grapes from a bowl. Tell me about them. Varys was in the living quarters of the rented manse, sitting on a small chair while Prince Rhaegar and Lord Steffan Baratheon, a huge man, Varys had only seen Lengsman taller, and they were narrow like bowstrings. Lord Steffan was thick as an ox. He leaned on his arm, facing the prince. I have reached out and secured 3 tentative commitments from suitable parties, Prince Rhaegar, and a possible 4th I am still working on. A lie, Varys had all 4, but the truth he wanted to show to Rhaegar relied on Rhaegar being drawn into his lies. The first is the daughter of Melian Velps, an old merchant family with ties back to the first settlement of Volantis by the freehold. They are staunch elephants, and of course, of pure Valyrian blood like all the matches I've found for you. Prince Rhaegar looked rather bored, which might insult the Velps, but that would be fine. She is 16 years old and considered very pretty, with purplish silver hair and red eyes. I have secured an invitation for you to visit her within the Black Walls. The prince narrowed his eyes. I should not need an invitation to walk within the Black Walls of Volantis if the Grand Maester speaks truly about their practices. Rhaegar leaned up. I am of Valyrian blood, the greatest such blood left in this world. You are correct, Your Highness, and yet the Volantine do not necessarily see it that way. They might or they might not deny you, based on your ancestors' marriage to the houses of Westeros, or just because of politics. If they choose not to deny you, rest assured it will only be because they want something from you. Varys paused for a moment as the prince lay back down on his side, looking angry. Varys spoke again, carefully this time. Thus it is easier if we secure invitations, it bears less risk for both your goals and theirs. Rhaegar's lip curled into a sneer, but he eventually relented. Fine. He snapped. I shall play this shell game, but not for long. Of course, Your Highness, and I believe all of the women I've arranged to meet you here are suitable for your requirements, Varys said smoothly, continuing to lead the prince along by a trail of breadcrumbs. In truth, all of them were only barely satisfactory, except for the one Varys wanted him to pursue. The next is Oriana Loja. Her family is just as old as the Velps, and she is 24 years of age, still well within her fertility. Varys continued. She is the head of her house, as her father died 2 years ago of the walking fever. A quiet woman, she would bring you much in the way of old knowledge from Valyria. That said, she is a blood purist and may consider you lesser for your Westerosi heritage. The prince, who had been looking more interested, soured at those words, though perhaps Oriana would break past that preconception he'd placed in the prince's head, regardless though, she was too poor. The Lojas had been on a decline for more than 100 years. Continue, Rhaegar said dryly. The third that I have fully secured is Morella Baaldiran. She is a captain in the noble spears, the guards who protect the Black Walls, and her family are staunch tigers. They have a noble lineage of Valyrian descent dating back to the Rhoynish Wars, and she herself has a fearsome reputation. If you wish to tap into the more militant aspect of Volantis, she is a good choice and a healthy woman in prime childbearing age. An ideal candidate except, Varys let the statement hang in the humid air for a moment, leaving the two in suspense. Actually, well, I do not wish to raise your hopes too much with the fourth candidate I am working on. It's unlikely she'll accept the arrangements. Don't waste the prince's time, eunuch. Lord Stefan said, his powerful voice filling the room for the first time in the conversation. You clearly have something to say, so speak. Varys frowned, but inside he was cheering. This was exactly what he wanted. Now to make it just a bit better, he turned his gaze to Rhaegar, implicitly asking the prince to affirm Lord Stefan's order. The Targaryen nodded slowly. Speak, Halfman. Varys suppressed a wince at the insult, but he knew he was pushing it with this nonsense. It was simply imperative that Rhaegar thought this last candidate was desirable of his own volition, not because Varys was talking her up. The most prestigious possible candidate I am still negotiating to get you a meeting with, Prince Rhaegar, Varys said, hunching forward and resting his head on his hand. Valia Balea Orios was, until 2 months ago, one of the triarchs of Volantis. Rhaegar leaned upwards in his seat at that, and Lord Stefan shifted against the wall. She is a tiger, like Lady Morella, but her family is far more prestigious. The Baleas were sorcerers in Old Valyria, a prestigious family even before the fall, and after it, they merged with the line of the Dragonlord Orion, after he marched to his doom in Valyria. Varys tapped his fingers on his cheek. She is a powerful woman, and still within childbearing age for many years yet, though she is older than you, Your Highness, Varys said quietly. But between her blood, her wealth, and her position, there is no finer woman in Volantis. Not unmarried. She has been difficult to secure a meeting with, however. Rhaegar seemed to be deep in thought. A Dragonlord's descendant, he mumbled, the blood of another Dragonlord house might do well to strengthen House Targaryen. He leaned back. Has there been any particular reason for the delay? Does she, like others, consider herself too pure for House Targaryen? There was a dangerous edge to his tone, one that Varys was careful to mollify. She hasn't expressed any such opinion to my knowledge. Rather, I understand that she took the loss of her position as Triarch somewhat badly and that she has been resistant to all forms of political outreach. Actually, it was why it had been so easy for Varys to secure the meeting between them. She had taken the defeat badly, but the Targaryen prince looked like a way out of an increasingly disastrous political situation. I have heard little back from her, but I do still have a few tools left to make use of if you think she is most desirable. Rhaegar snorted. Obviously, do what you must, just make it happen. The prince reclined. Of the ones you spoke of, she is the only one that sounds interesting. Exactly as I planned. Varys kept the smile off his face as he clasped his hands together and nodded. I will put some additional favors into play at once then, by your leave. As Rhaegar waved him out, Varys stepped out into the hot Volantine sun with a grin, even as he wiped the sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. Now all that was left to do was to arrange the time and date. He loved dealing with these Westerosi nobles. It was like feeding candy to a dog. You just put it in front of them and they'd never question where it came from. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 277 AC First Moon. A small war breaks out between Myr and Tyrosh over naval actions taken by the former against pirates in the Stepstones aligned with the latter. Pentos seeks to become involved on the side of Myr, but Braavos orders them to avoid joining the hostilities. Thus far, the war largely consists of piracy and naval actions directed at pirates allied to each city, with the navies of the two cities loath to leave themselves open to Braavosi intervention. Fighting has likewise picked up in the disputed lands between the two cities. Lannister. Chapter 54. Horse trading in a university eye. Marwyn the Mage Pav. He stroked the chin of little Lyria slowly, the white raven cooing as she did when shown affection. It was a shame that the albino bird was growing old. She had perhaps one more of his journeys in her, and then it would be the end for his favorite raven. Almost ashamed to waste some of the bird's time on this farce, but he couldn't exactly turn it down. It wasn't as if he was doing anything more important at the moment, and he was the seneschal for the year. It was the only reason he wasn't back out in the field, to the east or south where magic still held strong. Go over this with me again. He scratched his nose idly, looking at Archmaester Norrin across the table, looking just as annoyed to be dealing with Marwyn as Marwyn was to be dealing with him. You're asking the son of Lord Tywin Lannister to come here so that we can what? Bully him into giving up some new toy the Lannisters have created. Norrin frowned. I doubt the boy created it, but Maester Eomund and House Lannister claim that he did. The skinny man said. They're being incooperative, but if we get the child to confess who truly made it, or to offer it himself, then we can use their words against them. Is this about that drama that saw Loudon thrown out of Lannisport a few months ago? Marwyn asked, grumbling. So what if the Lannisters can make a few books? It's not as if that's a problem for us. Or rather for me. Marwyn continued to feed his raven. This entire thing just seemed like a mess waiting to blow up in the Citadel's face, not that such things were particularly uncommon for the gray sheep he worked with. Someone was always sleeping with some lord's wife, and the Citadel was always having to cover it up to save face. Not just a few. Norrin snapped. Thousands. Tens of thousands. In short order at that. It's like nothing that's ever been done in the history of Westeros. He sneered. Aren't you the one always telling us to have an open mind, Marwyn? Can you not see the potential of that sort of production? Marwyn blinked at the fervor in the man's tone, and settled into his chair, considering him. Tens of thousands, you say? He asked. That seems a bit exaggerated. You have proof of this. Marwyn considered himself a man who knew a great deal about a great many subjects. He had traveled the world and learned magic in the city of Dark Ashai, where the wind whipped through the empty city like the screams of the long dead, the poisoned legacy of the great empire of Dawn. He had traveled through the silent forest of Iquivaran and had learned the tongue of Ib to be let into their hidden heartland, seen the cities they cut into the mountains. In short, he had seen more of the world than any other man in Westeros, most likely. He had seen no mechanism or trinket to write 10,000 books in a few months. Maester Loudon saw them with his own eyes before they threw him out, and Maester Eomund confirmed as much in his own letters on the matter. Unclear as they were, Norrin said quickly. The Archmaester of Tongues with his electrum mask looked at him frantically. Imagine what we could do with such a thing. And yet they deny it to the Citadel. They claim the boy made it, that he was blessed by the seven-faced god. Norrin threw his head back. They're using it to write copies of the seven-pointed star of all things. Already the most copied book on the continent. What could you possibly need more of them for? Are they now? Marwyn couldn't really think of a particular reason to print that many copies of the Holy Book, save perhaps to give the Septons a break from their forever dull tasks of scribing it again and again. Still, if Loudon and Eomund had both reported it, despite being in a spat, I suppose I can see your purpose now. Marwyn sighed, tugging at his brow. Is there a reason that you haven't informed the rest of the Citadel about this discovery of yours, or of the Lannisters rather? Norrin looked slightly uncomfortable at that, and Marwyn knew at once why. The man had no doubt been looking forward to taking all of the credit for bringing it into the citadel. A petty motivation for hopes of acquiring a tool this useful. Well, your purposes notwithstanding, I can see why you've invited the boy, what with him in the city. Marwyn rubbed his forehead, idly considering which god it'd be appropriate to pray to for this sort of thing. Perhaps the mother Royne. Supposedly she was good with children. Do you have any idea when he's supposed to? Archmaesters, your guest is here. An acolyte said from the doorway, and Marwyn paused, then sighed. A moot question, I suppose. He grabbed his rod and mask, which were tied together by a small golden string. The light Valyrian steel clanked against each other but was utterly undamaged as he placed them up on the table, still in his grasp, a small power play to show his rank. He didn't particularly enjoy talking to children, generally, but it'd be better if the Lannister boy was cowed right away. The first one to come tromping in was a knight, tromping in with plate armor, Westerland's make unsurprisingly with a bassinet helm. 3 black hounds passant on a yellow field. Marwyn didn't recognize the heraldry, but the boy behind him was far more obvious. Golden hair down past his shoulders and emerald green eyes, fair skin. He wore a red jerkin with gold cloth embroidery. Features were on the surface effeminate, but clearly a boy from the chin, probably just down to being a child. Definitely the Lannister boy, he had all the traits of the family, sharp eyes too. Marwyn held his tongue as Norrin made introductions. Good afternoon, my Lord Lannister. The Archmaester's voice sounded saccharine, dripping with false respect. I'm glad that you chose to accept our invitation so quickly. We were just discussing your arrival, and didn't have time to prepare. I am Archmaester Norrin, and this is Archmaester Marwyn, our current seneschal here at the Citadel. The boy's green eyes widened somewhat as they flickered to Marwyn, glancing at his rod and staff, before up to meet his gaze. Marwyn saw recognition in those eyes. This boy knew who he was. That was surprising actually, very surprising. He was well known in Aldtown, and amongst academic circles, but not further beyond, and mostly for the nickname that idiot Violin had given him. The boy turned back to Norrin quickly enough though, responding politely but dryly. Callum Lannister. I fortunately have an hour or two before I am to go visit the Starry Sept. The boy seemed entirely unawed by their status, as Archmaesters, which was not entirely unsurprising. He was the son of a great lord after all, and the Lannisters were not famed for their humility. I am curious why you invited me though. I had actually looked into learning here before returning to the Westerlands, but my father denied it. There was a hint of apprehension in the boy's voice. That was curious, what did he have to be apprehensive about? Marwyn had seen those same tells in many an acolyte that had done something wrong and did not want to share what exactly that was. Curious. Ah, we asked that you visit because of our curiosity, you see, Norrin said, without missing a beat. Our good friend Maester Eomund writes us that it was you, and not he, that created the book stamping device that your family is now using to copy the 7-pointed star. The old man smiled broadly. We were hoping that you might be willing to share it with the Citadel, to help preserve and spread the wisdom that we Maesters have gathered here. The Lannister boy's demeanor shifted, his red lips parting slightly as his weight went from one foot to the other, his eyebrows rising. Marwyn caught it, but he wasn't sure if Norrin did. The boy hadn't been expecting that line of questioning at all. That was curious, if not about the book device then what? Ah, yes, I did invent the printing press, though I can understand why you would choose not to believe it. The change in demeanor was evident there too, more confident now, as if he had this discussion before. I could be convinced to share them with the Citadel for a price, he said simply, with the rough expression and tone of a Carthene horse trader in Vase Dothrak. Marwyn suppressed a chuckle, it really did look strange on such a young boy. Ah, but won't you consider the good that we can do with it? Norrin asked. After all, this would not be the same as sharing the tool with some great house, or a merchant seeking profit. The Citadel would use it for the good of all, to water the tree of knowledge. The plea sounded earnest, but Marwyn couldn't stand the obvious exaggeration. The Citadel was perfectly capable of paying for things. He decided to speak up. What sort of things would you ask us in payment, Callum? Marwyn cut through the nonsense. This child was clearly precocious, not the type to fall for such idiotic ploys. Norrin looked scandalized, but Marwyn didn't care. I honestly haven't given it much thought, the blonde replied, rubbing his cheek with his finger. I gave it to the church out of a sense of religious duty, but I have no such piety towards the Citadel. The Lannister stopped a moment in thought, before continuing. And if the price is too small, I suspect father will be angry with me. Lannister. Chapter 55. Horse trading in a university. I honestly haven't given it much thought, the blonde replied, rubbing his cheek with his finger. I gave it to the church out of a sense of religious duty, but I have no such piety towards the citadel. The Lannister stopped a moment in thought, before continuing. And if the price is too small, I suspect father will be angry with me. Marwyn considered him, tapping his finger on the table. He could imagine that the children of Tywin Lannister had ample reason to fear their father's anger. The rains of Castamere were occasionally heard as far away as Volantis. Still, this was good, the power was in their hands to make offers, even if the implicit threat that it couldn't be too small was there loud and clear. You mentioned you wished to study at the Citadel, but your father denied it. Do you know why? I expect he wants me home quickly. I'm returning from 6 months with my betrothed in Dorne, Callum said, coolly. I had actually wanted to attend your lectures, Archmaester Marwyn. I'd heard of you during my time in King's Landing. Marwyn felt his interest in this boy rise considerably. A would-be student of the higher mysteries perhaps. He didn't bother hiding his interest. Is that sort of knowledge the payment you seek? Marwyn considered the boy strange, yes, but most who took lessons from Marwyn were strange. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck begin to stand up, considering the potential that such an arrangement might have for. Perhaps in some small part. The boy wore a resigned expression. I doubt my father would be content with it if I only pursued my own interest without considering that of House Lannister. Marwyn frowned, leaning back in his seat. Ah, right, a potential interesting acolyte, thwarted by the politics of lords as they so often were. He sighed and scratched his face, tacitly letting Norrin take over once again. Oh, well, the Citadel does have some financial resources we could spare to purchase 1 or 2 of the special devices, the linguist said quickly. A few thousand dragons perhaps, or perhaps some famous artwork from our vaults. Callum turned back to the other Archmaester and frowned, his green eyes sharp. Actually, I think I've just thought of what I'd like as payment. His mood seemed to improve as he spoke. I think I should like, let's say, 24 maesters and acolytes to come to teach in Lannisport for a few years, 5 years, let's say 5 years. They'd be teaching lessons freely open to the general public, on whatever subjects they specialize in, and there ought to be at least one with a good chain for maths and numbers. Marwyn blinked, pulled back out of his disappointed fugue by the boy's offer. That was probably worth a few thousand gold dragons, but would be less directly costly to the Citadel all things considered. It wasn't as if there weren't enough maesters with nothing to do, hanging about wasting their time. And what exactly would the Citadel receive for that agreement? He asked, tapping his rod on the table lightly, which made his mask clatter. I would, upon my return to Lannisport, ship down 3 copies of my printing press, along with a copy of the instructions to make it, and the type and ink used in it. I'd also include a primer on the nomenclature, terminology, and best practices for making use of the press, and so on. Essentially a full sharing of the technology. The Lannister boy said plainly. I suppose I'll also organize the construction of a teaching space in Lannisport for the visiting maesters, that shouldn't be too difficult. He turned to Marwyn. And since I'm being so generous, why don't you throw in some of those Valyrian glass candles you folk have so many of? Marwyn blinked, then smiled. They were actually quite valuable in the East, but the Citadel barely respected them anyway. He wasn't going to give them away freely, but in a situation like this. I think we could spare one. Norrin was nodding emphatically, the man probably thought they were mostly worthless. Like most of the Order, he had little respect for magic. Marwyn could tolerate it just this once since it meant giving a candle to someone who might actually have an interest in using it. Good enough. The boy, Callum nodded. Now, it's best we get this all written up in a contract and signed. The blonde smiled. I don't suppose anyone would have paper and a quill in the Citadel of all places. Septon Kalrik Pav. The scent of incense hung always in the sacred halls of the starry sept. 700 pillars spiraled up 7 walls in the central chamber, the columns were white marble crackled with veins of blue and black stone, they stood in row upon row and held up the great dome that sat above the entire sept. Towering and mighty, the whole building was a wonder of Andal architecture from the old days of the Gardener kings. The once seat of the High Septon had lost much of its power in the years since Baelor had moved the faith to King's Landing, but not an ounce of its splendor. On the inside of the massive dome, there was an intricate painting of the night sky, some 800 years old. The painters had used powerful pharaias purchased from Essos to view the 7 wanderers in the heavens. The great spheres were each painted in glorious detail, sacred to the 7, leading to the light of the sun at the dome's highest point. It was the only source of natural light within the main chamber of the Great Sept, a single window at the top of the dome to represent the sun. The other lighting came from braziers at the sides of the pillars and prayer candles in the pews. To step into the starry sept was like stepping outside into a night where all the stars of heaven show with silvery light, a sacred place, a holy space. There was no night and day within its walls, only the haze of incense drifting up from the altar and the sound of reverent chanting echoing through the pillars. Here, men came to beseech the seven for truth. In these halls, more visions were given and prophecies made under the starry sky than in all the other septs of the world. Whatever they said in King's Landing, this was the true heart of the faith, as Callum saw it. It was here that he led sermons every evening, and it was here that he spent his days, meditating before the altar and overseeing the lesser septons and septas as they went about their tasks. His robe dragged behind him as he crossed the marble floor, his hands in his sleeves as he went to greet their newest guest. Normally, he only wore the full regalia of his office during sermons, along with the seasonal vestments that were expected to honor the seven faces of God. Today though, he was meeting with the son of a major house lord, a Lannister son, and one who had been proclaimed blessed by the Gold Star Sept. As for whether that was true, Callum was unsure. On the one hand, many were the times that someone perfectly ordinary would be proclaimed blessed because of some quirk of fate or circumstance, sometimes perhaps they were truly blessed by the seven with some miracle, but not to the extent that it would happen twice. On other occasions, men simply made up fanciful tales and called themselves blessed, or enticed their friends to do so. It was difficult to discern the truth of the seven's blessings without a thorough investigation of events. This was not an ordinary case, however. The Gold Star Sept had not proclaimed this Lannister boy blessed based on something that had happened to him, but because of something he had done. The child had crafted a tool, a stamp that could make books, copies of books, and endlessly in but a few moments. He had brought it to the faith with a holy mission, to give a copy of the seven-pointed star freely to every household in the Westerlands. This much was not in contention. The Gold Star Sept had sent no less than 10 of the copies they had produced south to Aldtown as proof. Callum had one in his office. There was thus no question that Callum Lannister had done a wonderful thing, a great work that all good men smiled upon, doubly so from a boy so young. The question was whether he had truly been blessed by the smith, whether he had been given the knowledge, mission, and vision to pursue it by the hand of the divine, or whether it had simply occurred to him through mortal means. Lannister. Chapter 56. Reflections in the Crone's Lantern. Septon Callum Pav. There was thus no question that Callum Lannister had done a wonderful thing, a great work that all good men smiled upon, doubly so from a boy so young. The question was whether he had truly been blessed by the smith, whether he had been given the knowledge, mission, and vision to pursue it by the hand of the divine, or whether it had simply occurred to him through mortal means. That was what Callum would attempt to determine today. Tricky as it might be. He clasped his hands together and prayed for truth. Father, help my judgment, he prayed as he passed the statue of the solemn patriarch, rod in hand. Crone, guide me to the truth of your will. He nodded as he passed the bringer of prophecy, her lantern low. As he approached the front of the sept, Callum saw the child surrounded by a gaggle of septons and septas, who were asking him questions in a hubbub. Talking, yelling, shouting over each other as they surrounded the child, who was standing next to a knight in armor, his bodyguard no doubt, and trying to answer their questions, but hardly getting a word in. Callum saw this happening but chose to observe the Lannister son for a moment, to take his measure. Watching the boy, he couldn't help but be taken back a bit by how pretty he was, small and fair. The boy's skin was pale save for the red freckles on his face, and he could easily have been mistaken for a girl, especially from the clarity of his emerald eyes as he looked from septon to septon and tried to get his answers out fast enough. He looked perhaps a tad flustered, but not so much that he was willing to shout back at the septons. Slender and short, he clutched a copy of the seven-pointed star to his chest with his left hand. It looked like one of the ones that came off of his presses. A personal copy perhaps. Callum's eyes were drawn from it to the boy's clothes. Callum Lannister had arrived at the starry sept dressed in a plain red jerkin with no embellishments, a pair of simple leggings, and small boots. The clothes were humble, very humble indeed for a Lannister. Callum knew that the boy likely had far finer things in his wardrobe, or even his traveling trunk. He was stopped from pondering whether that was an intentional choice as the knight beside the boy looked about ready to punch one of the aggressively probing septons. Callum raised his hands, stepping forward as the silver cloth about his neck glimmered in the firelight. With the practice of a lifetime preacher, he breathed in deep and projected from his belly. Enough. The sound of his voice and the recognition of it stilled his subordinates' tongues, their eyes turning back to him, and nearly all suddenly bore sheepish expressions. They had gotten away from themselves, curious to see if this boy truly was as blessed as was claimed. Step back from the boy, can't you see you are pressing him too far? Calric's voice was chiding, a deep baritone that spoke with command. Sometimes, he wondered if it was the only reason he'd been elevated to head the Starry Sept. At once the multitude of faithful men and women drew back, leaving the boy and the knight the only ones remaining. The child looked frazzled, his cheeks red as he glanced back and forth, seeing the clergy draw back, his emerald eyes gazing back and forth through the hazy air. Then, as silence reigned at Calric's command, the boy turned to him and met his gaze. Those green eyes blazed against Calric's blue, reflecting the dim light of the candles behind him, and Calric could swear that he heard the ringing of bells in the distance, the sounds of thunder, and a strange smell in his nostrils. Then, as if on some hidden cue, the moment was over, and the boy bowed, deeply at the waist, his golden hair falling down over his face to hang from his head like a veil. Calric felt his heart quiver, but he shook it off in a moment, his voice lower now, not shouting, though it still echoed through the great space under the sept's artificial night. Come to me, child, let me see your face. The queerness of the moment set Calric's hand to trembling. Were the seven truly working before him? Or was it a trick of his mind? He couldn't be sure. He needed to meet those eyes once again. He needed to be sure. The boy rose, looking nervous, his hand rubbed against his arm. As you say, Holiness. Calric saw that he was frightened, and felt pity rise in his heart. He was still so small, just a child, but that did not change Calric's purpose. As part of the most devout, as a follower of the seven, he could not stop until he was sure. The child walked to him and stood before him, looking forward, his back straight as an arrow. Calric reached down and took the boy's chin in his hand, and as he raised the boy's head, the Lannister child gasping in surprise, he saw those eyes once again, and the fire reflected in them. Calric breathed deep of the sweet smoky air, and he held that gaze, not with his eyes, but with his soul, praying to the seven for clarity of vision. And all at once, his prayer was answered, the sound of bells, a rhythmic drumbeat, not bells at all, but hammers shaping steel, the thunder came from the metal spitting fire, the smell acrid white smoke. He saw the green of the boy's eyes and the orange of the fire waver, and in it, he saw an ocean of fire, a wheel cracking, and breaking, only to be bound in iron and reforged, a seven-pointed star of steel raised on a banner above a city of gold, a crown of light and a sound of glass shattering. Are you all right, Holiness? The boy's lips spoke, but Calric barely heard the words. Stepping back, his hand recoiled from the boy's face as if burned, and he could not bear to look into those eyes a moment longer. Instead, his eyes rose, his mind turning to the statue of the crone resting beyond the pillars, on a plinth above the boy's head. The world seemed to turn around him, and he could swear the stone moved, that the crone raised her lantern, but the next moment it was gone, back to being held at her hip. Calric felt his heart thunder in his chest. The Lannister boy stared up at him in concern. He pulled himself back to his composure and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. I'm well, my boy. His deep voice nearly cracked, but slowly the most devout regained himself, his mind still reeling, but more in control. Yes, quite well. The boy seemed to know nothing of what had happened, of the vision that had filled Calric's mind. Calric did not know if the boy was blessed in the way the Gold Sept claimed. Visions could be fickle things, but he could say for certain that there was something more than natural behind the eyes of the child in front of him, innocent and frail as he might seem. I apologize if I discomforted you, I merely felt a strange presence in your eyes. Yes, best to buy himself time, take an evening or two to think about the vision, and consider its meaning. Come, follow me, I shall be your guide to this holy place, child. Will there be questions? The boy asked, glancing back and forth nervously. I don't know how many I'll be able to answer. I haven't studied theology as much as I'd like to. Calric felt his heart ease a little bit. That was an altogether more natural response, not some vision of great import, though said vision still rang in his ears. Calric nonetheless knew well how to comfort a scared child. I'll avoid theology then. Calric smiled. Come, and do not worry. Calric gave the boy a gentle smile. In this place of comfort, there is no need for fear. Somehow it seemed like the boy didn't believe him. Perhaps because Calric's heart was still roiling with fear himself. Lannister. Chapter 57. Confirmation and Blessing I. Septon Calric Pav. The distant chirping of birds was drowned beneath the thundering of the starry Sept's 7 bell towers as the sun rose over the city of Aldtown, creating the tops of the red mountains far to the east to send brilliant shafts of light raining down through the spotty cloud cover. With each toll of the great bells, the air shook, calling each and every child of the oldest city in Westeros to rise for the new day. Calric was no different, though in truth he had found little respite these past 2 nights. Locked in his thoughts, his dreams had turned to the vision he had seen. Fires orange and green blazed in his dreams with lights and sounds unseen and unheard. Calric had never had such vivid dreams before, nor had he seen such a vision as he'd found in the eyes of Callum Lannister. Alas, he was not entirely sure what it meant. That was the difficulty with things like this. He believed the boy was blessed now. How could he not when so many things lined up for it to be so? But was the Gold Star Sept's interpretation of his blessing correct? Ah, there was the rub. Just because there was something blessed, something supernatural about the child, that did not mean that one should leap to conclusions about exactly what that meant. His vision had, after all, been more than a little confusing. It was a puzzle, something to chip away at until he had a better understanding of what was truly going on. In terms of the child's blessing, the smith was surely involved, but the boy looked more like the maiden, and it had been the crone that had blessed him with the vision in the child's eyes. Questioning the boy had revealed little else to go on, besides that he confirmed he could not explain where or how he received the knowledge of how to build his presses, and that he did consider it a holy mission to spread the 7-pointed star. It gave no special insight into his character or the character of the blessing he had received. All he could say of the nervous boy was that he surely wasn't similarly blessed by the warrior or the father. He lacked that aura of confidence that great warriors or elder statesmen gave off. In fact, he had spent the entire questioning looking increasingly uncomfortable. Not that he was to be blamed for that, blessed or not, he was still a child. Calric had spent all day yesterday pondering what the vision he had seen meant for the matter. He had shared his vision with a few of his close confidants and discussed it with them, but they had all come to different conclusions regarding what the vision meant. The only parts they had agreed upon were that metalworking was clearly part of it. The sounds of hammers on anvils, the fire and smoke, the wheel being reforged in iron, perhaps the boy was destined to perform some great feat of smithing, like rediscovering the secrets of Valyrian steel, or making a new blade like Dawn, the sword of House Dane. Borman and Septa Annette thought so, but that was where the agreements ended. The city of gold and the banner with the 7-pointed star was probably Lannisport, in Calric's opinion, but Annette thought he might found a new city, and Borman thought it might be metaphorical and actually symbolize him hoisting the banner to the 7 heavens. There was a similar debate regarding the crown of light and the ocean ablaze with fire. Whatever they meant, the boy was clearly special and had a destiny given to him by the 7. On that, they could all agree, but nothing more, so now it was left to Calric to figure out what to make of all this, what reply to send the Gold Star sect, and whether to make a public announcement. He rather hated that he didn't have more time to make such a weighty decision, but the blonde boy would be leaving Old Town today once his convertees were confirmed in the light of the 7. While he could wait and make the announcement after the boy was gone, it would lessen its impact, so in a way the two would be a choice. As he walked into the artificial evening of the central chamber, he made his decision. The 8 convertees were a motley bunch of foreigners. 6 men and 2 women, 2 fat and 1 ugly, a brown-skinned Summer Islander and a Lysini woman that he had no doubt had once been a whore. Only 2 of them looked proper at all, the man in Bravo C garb and the plain woman with dark makeup around her eyes. The rest, he thought, looked like scoundrels. He had to wonder where the Lannister boy had found them. Truly you could meet strange people in Dorne. The blonde stood behind them, glancing up at the dome of stars above. Still, while the 8 before him were a mismatched bunch, the Lannister child had nonetheless persuaded each and every one of them to convert to the faith of the 7, to be confirmed in the saving light of Calric's God. So he would treat them with respect, and not denigrate them despite their poor appearance. Calric patted his chest and cleared his throat. Supplicants. His voice boomed through the hall, catching the attention of a few passing septons and septas, who paused to watch the ceremony. You have come humbly into this sacred place to join the great fraternity of the holy. With truth and love, I greet your coming, and with open arms, I welcome you, for all sons and daughters of men are saved when the 7 hold them in their arms. Conversions were fairly uncommon, mostly being associated with marriages between Andals and First Men families, but still frequent enough that Calric could remember the words by heart. He gestured with his hand, come forth, each of you in turn, state your name and place your bread and salt upon the altar. Calric gestured first to the Summer Islander, who stood on the left side of the line. The dark-skinned man rose to his feet and approached the altar. In his left hand, a bowl of salt, in his right a loaf of bread. My name is Xantri Molo, he spoke, bowing slightly to Calric before moving to the altar. With these gifts, I welcome the seven into my heart. His accent was thick and hard to parse, but they were the right words, and he placed his salt and bread on the altar before stepping back and returning to the line. Next, the plain woman came forth. My name is Pella Bikid, and with these gifts, I welcome the seven into my heart. In turn, she placed the bread and salt upon the offer and went back to the line, and the next one stepped up, and then the next after that. My name is Burik Roth. Loam Ducaris. Mela Losganu. Malek Bismention. Nolo. Hashel Moandro C, and with these gifts I welcome the seven into my heart. The strange skinny man with the olive skin murmured as he placed his gifts on the altar, before returning once more to the line. There were 8 pairs of eyes turning to Calric as he surveyed the lot of them. It is a wondrous day that you, humble supplicants, have entered into this holy place and allowed the seven-faced God to enter your hearts, to raise your spirits and place them by his side in the heights of the heavens. May the Father's virtue flow upon your brows like wine, and may the Mother watch over your path. May the crone's light shine where you walk even in dark places. May the maiden's virtue settle around your shoulders like a cloak, and may the warrior's arm give you strength in times of hardship. May the smith guide your hand to make great works, and may the stranger guide you gently when you die. Calric finished the proclamation, his voice filling the hall, thundering now. The light of the seven who are one shall shine from your hearts and from your minds, holy words shall be on your tongues and righteousness shall guide your hands. Go forth now, and do no wrong. Calric took a moment to catch his breath, having finished the confirmation. As it stood officially, the ceremony was over. However, Calric had a bit more to do, before any of them could stand, or the septons and septas watching had a moment to return to their chores. Calric raised his finger and fixed it squarely on the child that had brought these 8 to be converted. Hold, one more soul will I speak of today. Calric gestured with his hand. Come here, boy. Lannister. Chapter 58, Confirmation and Blessing 2. Septon Calric Pav. However, Calric had a bit more to do, before any of them could stand, or the septons and septas watching had a moment to return to their chores. Calric raised his finger and fixed it squarely on the child that had brought these 8 to be converted. Hold, one more soul will I speak of today. Calric gestured with his hand. Come here, boy. Callum Lannister looked taken aback by the proclamation, glancing back and forth before his shoulders slumped slightly, and he proceeded forward to stand by Calric. The boy needn't have worried, this was to be a joyous occasion. The most devout turned to the 8 new convertees and raised his right hand, placing his left upon the Lannister child's head, a smile finding its way to his old lips. You who have been brought to the Seven's light this day, know that you were brought here for this most holy confirmation by this child Callum of House Lannister's reverent heart, Calric said, finding the words as he went along. He hadn't had time to plan out a speech since making his decision, but he could feel the seven guiding him as he spoke. And rejoice also, for I tell you this day that 2 days past, when I first beheld the shining emerald eyes of this boy, this child of the seven-faced God, the crone saw fit to grant me a vision, and to confirm for me that this child was blessed, and blessed greatly. Calric felt the boy's head still beneath his palm, and he chuckled, glancing across the starry sept. In the lights of the braziers, shrouded by the incense smoke that drifted through the chamber, he could see many septons and septas watching now, even simple devotees from Old Town, men and women who had come here to pray with their families, all eyes now upon Calric and the child who the seven had seen fit to bless. He cleared his voice once more and spoke out across the room. His mind rolled as the words came one after the other, each louder than the one before. Hear me now, O witnesses, O holy servants of the seven-faced God, for by the vision given to me I have found this boy to be thrice blessed. Calric raised his arm high, the aches in his bones vanquished by the fervor in his heart. He pointed one finger towards the ceiling. The first blessing is the smith's, which has filled his mind with dreams of wondrous tools, tools he even now uses to glorify the seven in a holy mission for which he has been chosen. The most devout let the statement hang in the air while he raised a second finger. The second blessing is the maiden's, for she has crafted this child in her image to inspire our hearts with his purity and beauty, and his innocence and empathy have brought even these strange convertees to the seven's light. Under his hand, the boy made a choking noise, bending over slightly. Calric thought he could hear the quiet whispers of a prayer from the boy, calling on the seven-faced God over and over again. It truly was a holy moment. Now, his third finger raised. And lastly, the third blessing of this child was given by the crone, for it was her touch that turned his eyes to portals of prophecy, and her lantern that shines with light from his head. She has placed in him a great destiny, though none but the seven-faced god knows its ending. Calric at once at a spontaneous impulse he felt rush through him, reached down and pulled Callum Lannister, who was still murmuring prayers, from the ground, raising him up into the air with both hands to present before all the eyes of the starry sept, straight above the altar where the sunlight shone down through the one window in the top of the dome, illuminated for all to see. Calric's voice spoke at a fever pitch now, the madness of his zealotry taking him. Look upon this child and hear me, for I proclaim that he bears the blessings of the seven who are one, and in their name he shall change the world. Ilan Payne Pav. Sir Ilan Payne reclined in his chair, kicking his feet up on the stool in front of him and letting the sun beat down on his skin. The hot summer air set sweat to his brow, but it could hardly compare to the heat of the furnaces he'd been overseeing for the past 6 months. His right hand reached out, grasping for the goblet of wine he'd brought up to the balcony with him. The taste was meaningless to him since he'd lost his tongue, but he could still well feel the burn in his throat as he poured it into his mouth. Things had finally calmed down a little bit over the past few weeks. Not that they weren't still moving, but that the process had been pretty well hammered out. The presses, all 200 of them, were done and working 12 hours a day. The new paper mills that had been hastily raised in the narrow coastline between the wall of Lannisport proper and Castle Rock were churning out enough of the material to feed the presses, and the ink was mostly sorted. After months and months on end of one long grind, the pages were now flowing off of the presses by the hundreds of thousands into the vaults of Castle Rock. Several of the large chambers nearest to the Lion's Mouth, normally used to marshal the Lannisters' household knights in times of war, had now been converted into assembly shops. Leather covers cut and branded with the symbol of the seven elsewhere glue, cotton string, and the actual pages of the seven-pointed star were all brought into the rooms, and, in a process that Callum had called an assembly line, were slowly assembled together into completed books as they moved across a series of long wooden benches. About 10 men worked each table. As they went along, the pages were bound with the strong cotton string, and then glued into the covers. This process resulted in thick, stout books with a dark brown color from the stiffening treatment that was applied to their covers. There was some discussion of dyeing the leather red, but that had ultimately been discarded in favor of other changes under Lord Tywin's direction. The Lion of the Rock had put several contingencies in place when he had agreed to take over funding from the Faith, committing no less than 100,000 gold dragons to the continuation of his son's vision, as well as allowing the use of the lower sections of the rock near the Lion Mouth. The first of these contingencies required that the presses themselves be afforded to House Lannister upon the completion of the millionth copy of the seven-pointed star. The second was that the Faith of the Seven would handle all distribution of the copies across the Westerlands since they had more capability to do so through the Septons. The third requirement was that a stamped picture of Lord Tywin, and of his son Callum, would adorn the title page of each book, along with an acknowledgement that the book was made and given away by the goodwill of House Lannister. The last requirement was the most trouble in Ilan's opinion. While a woodcarver named Lewis had managed to make quite a good stamp of Lord Tywin, he had never actually seen Callum's face, and artistic imaginings of the boy made poor images that the Lion refused to accept. Lord Tywin indicated that Callum could decide on a suitable image when he returned from Dorne. This was all well and good as an idea, but Ilan couldn't actually have any of the now nearly 100,000 copies of the seven-pointed star distributed until that image was added. They all stood in large and carefully arranged stacks in one of the vaults that Lord Tywin had provided for the project, waiting to be stamped. Ilan just knew that it would be hectic when that last piece of the puzzle finally became available, so he was taking his time now to relax a bit and regain his strength for the inevitable effort to come. He felt the alcohol just starting to buzz when he was disturbed from his basking by a voice from the stairs. Sir Ilan, are you up here? It was Lucas, one of the merchant's sons he'd hired to help run this little gathering post of his. The lad sounded frantic, so Ilan sighed and waved his hand up above him, signaling to the young man. Ah, there you are. Lucas rushed over beside him, and Ilan glanced up at him trying to make it clear how much he appreciated being disturbed through facial expression alone. Alas, there was too much clay between Lucas' ears for such a signal to prove effective. Not that he wasn't glad about that fact once he started talking. Sir Ilan, I've heard news from the Rock. Sir. Lord Callum's boat just arrived at the castle's port. Ilan felt his eyelid twitch, as he very carefully did not spill the wine he was currently holding on his chest. A sigh, and he set the goblet down to the side, gesturing to it with a finger. Lucas could have it for all he cared, it wouldn't do to drink and then march up that damnable mountain. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 277 AC 16th day of first moon. News reaches the great sept of Baelor that the head septon of the starry sept, Septon Calric of the most devout, proclaimed that Callum Lannister, the son of Lord Tywin Lannister, hand of the king, was blessed by the smith, the maiden, and the crone above the altar of the starry sept in Aldtown. Lord Tywin Lannister is said to have immediately visited the great sept of Baelor to question the high septon about his son's blessing. The high septon, after 3 days of meditation and fasting, proclaimed that Septon Calric was certainly right, but that the boy surely must be blessed by the father too, as well as the warrior. King Aerys, apparently amused by the situation, made several jokes about the high septon wanting a larger throne of gold to sit on. Lannister. Chapter 59. Return of the Blessed Lion. Ilyn Pain Pav. Esser Ilyn, I've heard news from the Rock Esser. Lord Callum's boat just arrived at the castle's port. Ilyn felt his eyelid twitch, as he very carefully did not spill the wine he was currently holding on his chest. A sigh, and he set the goblet down to the side, gesturing to it with a finger. Lucas could have it for all he cared, it wouldn't do to drink and then march up that damnable mountain. He made no further gesture as he walked back into the merchant house, finding his way to a basin of water and wiping the sweat off of his face. He pulled his hair into a more presentable state, then fixed the shoulders of his vest, and headed to the bakery, since it was morning. Matthew, the older of the 2 bakers on staff, greeted him as he came down the stairs. Ah, Esser Ilyn, glad to see you Esser, he started, only for Ilyn to hold up a note he'd been scribbling on the walk down. Lord Callum returned to the rock, need to go see him. The baker's polite smile grew into an honest one. Ah, the blessed Lannister is back in the rock. He said, that's a wonderful thing Esser. Tell me, do you think he will visit us here in Lannisport? The man asked eagerly. Oh, or perhaps at the presses near the lion's mouth. Shall we go there to see him? Ilyn blinked, processing the man's words for a moment, but before he could even hope to put pen to page, the patrons of the bakery exploded into gossip and questions and Ilyn felt a headache start to grow as they all pressed him at once. Esser Ilyn, you know him, yes? Do you think he might invest in a... Oh, my daughter would love to meet him, blessed by the maiden they say he is. Do you think he would be willing to visit the South Hill Sept and say a blessing? Oh Septa Margot, I've got to go tell her that he's back. Are the rumors true that he's actually a girl pretending to be a man? Ilyn rubbed his forehead with one hand, and with the other wrote out a note on the back of the one he'd shown Matthew. We'll see. With those 2 words raised ahead of him, he pushed straight through the crowd of gossiping merchants, their wives, septons and septas, and made his way out the door onto the street, where he quickly marched to the stables and took his horse, Bleakwind, by the reins. Already, he could feel that the next few weeks at least would see him with little if any time to relax. Some 3 miles of riding later he was entering the Lion's Mouth back into Castle Rock, and perhaps 3,000 stairs after that, exhausted by the climb, he staggered up into the actual living area of Castle Rock, way up on the ocean-facing side of the mountain. Ah, Esser Ilyn. One of the servant women he honestly couldn't remember her name greeted him with a kind smile. You'll be looking for young Callum then? She asked, smirking at his current state of exhaustion from the stupid mountain he'd just had to hike right up to near the top of. Ilyn, still panting for air, fumbled for his notepad, and hastily scrawled out, water first, raising it for the woman to see. From the recognition in her eyes, she could actually read it, which was rather lucky as otherwise, he would have had to pantomime like a mummer to convey his meaning. The servant woman laughed. I'll have that for you right away, Esser. She smiled at him, heading down a hallway towards the kitchens and soon returning with a cup of water, which he gulped down greedily after the long climb up. He gave her a smile of his own and handed her a note with, thank you, scrawled across it, before heading down the hall on his own, having a pretty good guess of where Callum was likely to be. He turned out to be right on the money, finding the boy in his father's study conversing with his uncle, Lord Kevin. The older blonde was busy hearing the story of Callum's trip to Dorne and Aldtown, and he barely gave Ilyn more than a glance as he entered. It was honestly amusing, just how similar Lord Kevin's mannerisms were to Lord Tywin's. For a man who had always been his brother's right hand, he was more similar to Lord Tywin than he was different. Callum, however, gave a much sunnier greeting. Ah, Ilyn. The boy smiled, getting up from his chair to greet him. He looked Ilyn up and down, before giving him a smile. You look well, though also like you've just climbed the whole rock to get here. Ilyn made a show of rolling his eyes in response to the boy's teasing and shrugged. He had gotten well enough used to Callum's odd sense of humor during his time learning to write from the genius of a boy. "You've cut your hair," Ilan wrote, and that got a snort out of Callum, who was now wearing his hair cut back to end above his neck. It was now shorter than all of his siblings except little Tyrion. Callum colored a bit red at the comment but shook it off quickly. "I thought a change was in order after Septon Calric declared me to be the living visage of the maiden." The boy frowned. "I liked my hair too, but some things just aren't worth it." "For what it's worth, Callum," Lord Kevin said from across the room, chuckling. "With your haircut you're only a bit more girly than Jaime was at your age." "Jaime is practically identical to Cersei," Callum grumbled, before turning to his uncle. "Anyway, apparently the most devout Septon also managed to see visions in my eyes, which is where the talk about me being blessed by the crone comes from. He never told me what those visions were about though." The boy tapped his foot. "I heard Father had the High Septon declare me blessed too. Do you know if Father has some intention of sending me into the faith at this point?" "He hasn't written me about that at all." Kevin Lannister shook his head. "While it wouldn't be a terrible idea, given all the hubbub around you now, I still don't think that Tywin would send you to be a Septon. Tyrion perhaps, but you're still his second son, the backup if anything happens to Jaime, which it well might, given your brother's love of fighting." Callum shook his head. "I would be surprised if Jaime ever loses another fight in his life. If he dies it'll be poison or something that gets him." Callum smiled. "Though I take your point, uncle. Father probably likes the prizes I bring back too much to send me into the church." He paused. "Still, much as I dislike the nature of really just the one blessing I've been given, I think it might be worth it for me to start making tours of Lannisport, visiting the seps in the city, saying blessings over people at their weddings, things like that," Callum said slowly. "It will only build my reputation, and I want to search out a place to build my new academy." "I suppose that's reasonable enough," Kevin said, though after a moment he frowned. "But there's one issue. Esser Clegane tells me that you've hardly touched a sword since you left King's Landing." Callum blinked, then paled. It wasn't intentional. I had a lot of work to do, the presses in Dorne to oversee." "Irrelevant. What it means is that you've slipped behind in your martial training," Kevin said, coolly. "Catch back up to where a boy your age ought to be, and I'll consider letting you manage your affairs personally. Otherwise, Esser Ilan here has been doing a fine enough job of it without you." Ilan perked up at that, beaming with pride, even as Callum deflated. "Yes, uncle," the boy sighed, before straightening out, as he slipped into the mask Ilan always expected to see him wearing in most situations. The look of a dutiful son. "In that case, uncle, I will go to the yard and resume my martial practice at once." He paused. "Unless there's something else to discuss." Lord Kevin weighed him up for a moment, then shrugged. "No, I don't think there is. Go have at it, and don't let me hear you've been shirking again." "Yes, Esser." Callum saluted strangely with his hand, before marching right out the door. "Come along, Esser Ilan." Ilan blinked, glancing over at Kevin, who nodded, inclining his head toward the direction the boy had gone. Seeing it, Ilan hurried after his juvenile superior, wondering what impressive scheme he'd be responsible for executing next. It didn't take long at all before he was being ordered to lead the servants and miners in constructing a number of new workshops and living quarters in the rock and to start work on finding a suitable location for a second citadel to be built in Lannisport. By an hour after that, he was also organizing the purchase of copper jewelry wire, and then the hiring of a number of blacksmiths, and a pair of carpenters. All of it urgent, and all of it to favor some dozen schemes Ilan barely understood. Such was the work of the blessed boy's chief henchman. Equals 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 equals. If you'd like to support my work, or get early access to chapters before public release, you can join my Patreon. Link to join my Patreon. Patreon.com Moonlight 10. 0 comments 0 vote. Lannister. Chapter 60. Thoughts on family. Anne. Hey everyone. I know a lot of you have been wondering what happened to the story, so I just want to explain everything clearly. I didn't delete it, Webnovel automatically locked it. The first issue was with the cover art. I actually got full permission from the artist to use it, but somehow, the system still flagged it as a duplicate or copyright problem. Then, when I tried republishing, it got marked as spam, probably because I uploaded too many chapters at once and mentioned Patreon in the notes. After that, it got locked again 2 more times for the same reasons. Honestly, it's been really frustrating and disheartening. I never meant to cause any problems, and I truly regret all the confusion and lost progress. Still, I'm not giving up. I'm fixing everything carefully this time so the story can stay up without any more issues. Thank you all so much for standing by me through all this. Your patience, comments, and kind words mean the world to me. I really need your continued support now more than ever. Please keep sending power stones to help the fanfic grow and keep our progress moving forward. Kevin Lannister Pav. His nephews were unusual children. Not that he and his brothers had been particularly normal growing up, but he was sure it had been nowhere near to the level of Tywin's 3 sons. He rubbed his chin as he watched the yard from the open window of his study. Jaime and Callum were down there sparring, while little Tyrion, twisted and ugly, cheered them on from the side. Actually, maybe Tywin and Tygett were. Tywin had always had this bitter energy in his youth, the ill spirit that made him such a dangerous lord, and Tygett had killed his first knight at 10 by ripping the man's helmet off and plunging a dagger into his skull over and over and over again. Neither of them was particularly normal, but as far as Kevin was concerned, he and Garyon were perfectly typical examples of the Westerosi nobility. None of the 3 boys below him were normal. Tyrion, obviously, but Jaime and Callum too. Jaime was the most talented fighter that Kevin had ever seen, better even than Tygett, though not as bloody-minded. He hadn't been to the tourney at King's Landing, being left to hold down the fort at Castle Rock as usual, but Kevin imagined it must have been a truly remarkable bout between him and the Tyrell heir. When Tywin had returned in a huff from King's Landing, he had set about reshaping most of House Lannister's long-term political plans. While Cersei was still set aside for Prince Rhaegar, or if that failed possibly the infant Viserys in a few years, all plans for Jaime to marry a Tully girl have been shifted aside. Instead, the scheme had pivoted to the Reach and House Tyrell. Even now letters were flowing back and forth between King's Landing, the Rock, and Highgarden plotting out the exact details of Jaime's future. He would be sent to foster with and squire to Lord Luther Tyrell, and if all went well betrothed to one of the man's daughters. All because Jaime and Mace Tyrell beat the 7 blessed shite out of each other on the tourney field in front of half the nobility in the kingdom. Kevin snorted as the boy knocked his younger brother to the ground once again, sweeping Callum's legs out from under him. Yes, Jaime was turning out to be a remarkable child. An ideal heir in terms of martial prowess, Kevin had yet to see anyone not significantly older than the boy land so much as a scratch on him. It was a good thing, but it was plainly obvious that Jaime was no ordinary child. Kevin would put money down that Jaime Lannister was going to grow up into one of the most fearsome knights in the 7 kingdoms. The middle brother, however, stood out most of all. Callum Lannister had already upturned the world, even at such a young age. While other men might look elsewhere, claim that someone else had invented his presses, that it was House Lannister behind him or even Maester Eomund, Kevin was far too close to the boy to have such excuses. Callum had been tinkering up in that tower of his since he was 5 or 6. Since before many children could even read or write, he had been working on the device that now stamped out tens of thousands of books that before would have taken 3 months to write for a skilled scribe. 1,000 some odd workmen and their families had rapidly spread out into a new town before the Lion's Mouth, stretching across the enclosed region between the Rock and Lannisport and basically connecting the castle directly to the city. Smoke billowed up every day from furnaces smelting lead into new type for the 200 presses that filled the lower vaults with books. Kevin had been down to visit them several times, and it reminded him of the Arsenal of Bravos, which he had seen from afar. Except that the Arsenal of Bravos had been the work of many geniuses, a generation of shipwrights all working in tandem to create the process by which a galleass or a dramond could be assembled in a day. Callum had written the plans for all of his great work on his lonesome, at no older than 8 years, and with help from no one. Kevin was not an especially religious man, he said his prayers to the 7 but he didn't hold to them much outside the walls of the sept. Despite that, he found it hard to dispel the notion that Callum was blessed by the smith. It was simply too unbelievable otherwise, and what did that say for the rest of them? That they were living in a land where the 7-faced god worked through the hands of an infant. Callum was more unusual than any child had the right to be. Still, Kevin couldn't help but chuckle as Jaime knocked him on his ass again. It's nice to see that he's not exceptional in everything. Callum was no special talent at arms. Perhaps slightly above average in potential, but utterly unmotivated and thus slacking a bit behind where a boy his age ought to be. If Kevin had to put words to it, then Callum just didn't have the instinct for battle, or the urge to chase after the shadow of the warrior that many a young lord had. If the boy was otherwise unexceptional, it would doom him to a life of mediocrity, knighted late, and then cast off into some no-name house. But the boy was a Lannister, and with all his blessings and cleverness, Kevin didn't feel particularly worried about his prospects. As the sparring seemed to wrap up, with Jaime victorious on all counts, Kevin turned back to his actual work, piling up on his desk like a tower. The affairs of the Lannister holdings in the Westerlands needed a careful hand to manage. Though it was less demanding at least than before Tywin had instituted the Lord Temper system, it was still plenty of work for the Castellan of Castle Rock. And speaking of the Lord Tempers, he glanced over the letters his siblings had sent. Jenna, Tygett, Garyon, which one did he care to open first? Jenna was always lengthy, Tygett was always curt, and Garyon could go either way depending on his mood. Kevin shrugged and decided that Tygett first was the better way to get through them today. He cut open the letter with his knife and glanced over the note from his brother. Kevin, I've been dealing with an uptick of reaving by Ironborn fishermen from off Ironman's Bay. Since the investments of livestock and tools from further Ashamark have increased the harvest this last year, it has drawn some attention from the salty wretches. It's not all of them, most still keep the king's peace, but they protect their own, and it's hard to know which of the Ironmen are turning to their old ways. At any rate, I ask that you send a letter to Lord Quellan Greyjoy asking him to rein in his countrymen. My understanding is that he prefers to keep good relationships with the mainland. Regards. Tygett Lannister, Lord Temper of the North Coast. Kevin scratched his chin a little bit, considering that this was Tygett. He suspected that the man was having difficulties indeed if he was asking for help like this. Tygett was a man who preferred to solve things with his sword, well practiced in violence, and clever on the field. If these raiders were outmaneuvering him, then they were either befuddling him with their tactics, or he was simply not able to respond to them with the men he had on hand on the North Coast. Kevin set the letter to the side. Demanding that Lord Greyjoy rein in his sharks was all well and good, but Kevin would send some reinforcements up to support Tygett as well. Not too many, that would make him feel like he was being looked down upon, but enough to help him drive off some overmighty Ironborn. Kevin would consult with Tywin before writing to Lord Greyjoy at any rate. Picking up the next letter from Garyon, Kevin scanned it quietly, sipping at a cup of diluted red wine he kept by him on his desk. Dear brother Kevin, all has been going well in the Silver Valley since I began showing the Lannister banner with more regularity. I must thank you for your advice. The lion's roar sent the Serrat peacocks running back to their little hovel at Silverhill, and I've been making great strides at establishing a new castle at Sparkling Brook. The foundations for the keep are already down and the stone is being quarried out of the mountains all around. Good grey granite and a bit of sandstone for the floors, it's all coming along quite well. Running off the Serrat men who'd been harassing the people at Lost Glitter and Sparrowhill has also made me quite popular with the Tallowmen. I won't tell falsehoods, this, Lord Temper, arrangement is the best idea that Tywin's ever had. I'm considering even hosting a tourney once the castle's done, of course. There's quite a few Tallowmen hedge knights about, and they're quite good with their bows across the board. Some of the old men here even say they fought with alongside Tywin and you in the wars of the Ninnepenny Kings. I think it'd be a fine idea to let them really show their skills in a pauper's tourney or two. That said, brother, I do have a rather more sensitive topic to address with you and more plainly with Tywin. I've gotten a bit sweet on the daughter of one of the headmen in Sparkling Brook, a girl named Loria. She's got the loveliest auburn hair and I think I'd like to marry her, but obviously, I'd need Tywin's approval to do it. I wanted to know if you had any advice on how to approach him about this. I know she's below the status he'd probably look for me, but I'm also not getting any younger. I doubt I'm a particularly important piece in Tywin's civis game these days. At any rate, if you could tell me what you think, I'd like that. Thanks as always, Kevin. Your brother, Garyon. Kevin smiled as he set Garyon's note aside. His youngest brother seemed as cheerful as ever, chasing love with a yeoman's daughter out in the Silver Valley. Kevin would have to find a way to approach Tywin about that, carefully. He had been well enough willing to let Kevin marry Dorna, who was only a knight's daughter, but the knights were House Swift who were basically minor lords in their own right, and loyal servants of House Lannister besides. It would be trickier for even Garyon, who was the furthest living male Lannister from the succession, to marry a town headman's daughter. Perhaps Kevin and Garyon could find a way to promote them to a knightly house in a reasonable amount of time. That might justify it. He only skimmed Jenna's letter. It was 4 pages long and mostly discussed her young children. She was adoring of Cleos and Lionel, and already pregnant with a 3rd child now that Emmon and her were settled in with his Lord Temporship. Her letter gave few political details, beyond that the harvest was good and that Kevin could expect a moderate increase in incomes from Emmon's territory. Overall, it was about the same as most letters from Jenna these days. His sister was taking to being a mother with gusto, and while that was heartening, it was also making her political updates a bit less detailed. At this rate, he might actually have to converse with that old man Esser Emin. Kevin set the several page-long letter aside and sighed. Then he got to work writing the orders to send men north to help Tyget. The work he needed to get done today still towering over his desk like a grotesque. I should really try for children with Dorna again, he grumbled as he dipped his quill into the inkpot, licking his lips as he began to write. Perhaps that would take my mind off of all this work. Equals 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 equals. If you'd like to support my work, or get early access to chapters before public release, you can join my Patreon. Link to join my Patreon. Patreon. Com. Moonlight 10.